In this lesson, we're going to be connecting to a spreadsheet that's going to pull data from the spreadsheet using JavaScript and then output the results onto the page. We're going to be parsing through and reviewing the object that's being returned back. So this is a JSON object, and we're going to have to structure that in a proper JSON format and then extract the data as a JavaScript object. So if we make any updates to the spreadsheet and we refresh the page, that will be resulting there in the updated values. And that's the same for if we update any of these Boolean values. So the Boolean values where we've got true are going to set the row as green, and where we've got false are going to set the row as red. And this data is going to be the exact same data that we have within the spreadsheet. So when we do side by side, you can do a full comparison of how this data stacks up. So if we add in a value here, do a refresh, that value is now reflected within the web application using JavaScript. Go ahead and create your HTML file, and this is going to be the HTML file where we're going to output the content from the Google spreadsheet. And also I've created a JavaScript file. I've called it app11.js. So that's ready to go, and we're ready to make the connection and output the content within the web page. Got the editor on the left-hand side, the web page opened within the browser on the right-hand side. I'm going to also do an inspect and open up the dev tools within the Chrome browser. You are going to need to have a Google account in order to create a spreadsheet, and I've logged in, and I've opened up my Google Drive and created a spreadsheet, and this is just called example 1, where I've got some content that we can pull into our web application. So you are going to need to create a spreadsheet, and then you can populate it with whatever data you need. And in this case, what I've got is I've got my first column with the first name, and they're all unique, as I've just incremented the number for the first name. And then there's the last name. They all have unique IDs, and then they have different Boolean values for status. The first row within the spreadsheet, these are the headings for the columns of data. So we want to be able to share the spreadsheet content and then access it using a web API. So in order to share the content, we can go under File and Publish to the web. And then selecting the document that we want to publish, we're going to share sheet number 1 and publish it to the web. That gives us a URL that we can copy and paste to the web with the data that's coming from the spreadsheet. So even though this is shared as a web URL, this is only to display the data. So in order to access it via the API, there has been some changes to the way that the Google Docs can get shared and the Google Sheets do get shared. And this time, now we have to share them and provide permission to anyone with a link to be able to access and view the document. And this is where the API is going to be able to connect to it and pull that data from the spreadsheet as JSON data. So make an update to it and set it to anyone with a link, keeping in mind that now this link is going to be available to anyone that's looking to see, and they're going to be able to see the data that is available on the link. And you can keep it as viewer. Of course, you don't want to make it commenter or editor, and that's going to allow anyone with the link to be able to edit. So right now we just want to keep it at viewer, and make sure that you do keep it at viewer, as we just want to retrieve back the data within the JavaScript code. And then you can copy the link as well, and the link is going to include the ID of the sheet. So I'm going to copy the link, and that's just going to be a link directly to the web page. So selecting the ID, and the ID that's going to be unique for each spreadsheet is within the URI, and that's up here just past the D/, and this long set of characters is going to be the unique ID for this application. So go ahead and select that ID, as you're going to need it within your code. And now we can close that part and open up your JavaScript file and paste the ID into your JavaScript code, as we are going to need it as we construct the URL. So there is also a base URL, and the base URL is going to be the location and that's going to be the docs Google/spreadsheet/D. So let's select that, and we'll call that the base URL, and then another /. So essentially we're just generating that same path. And then we've got some additional syntax that we want to add in there. And that's going to be, instead of edit, we want to get the data. So that's going to be selecting the data, using the path. Instead of edit, we're using the Google visualization path, so it's GVZ, and then /, and then the TQ is going to be the query, and TQ, whatever we want TQ to equal. So when we look at that, that's actually going to download a text file. And when we open the text file, this is going to contain the query visualization response, which contains within an object, a JSON object format, all of the data that we want to select. So this is essentially going to be the path that we want to use and then output those results. And we can also include, for this path, a query. So this is like a SQL query where we want to select all of the available content. So it's going to be downloading it and selecting all of the available content within the sheet. We are going to also have to clean up some of this code, because this code here is going to be including additional content such as the empty columns. And then there's a lot of this null content. So if there's spaces, it's just coming back as null. And then we've got the version and the query response set information. So we do need to clean that content out so that we can retrieve the data. There's also a way to get it to output as a CSV file. So within the query string, if we update it, instead of just outputting to TQ equals select, if we add in the TQX equals out CSV, and then the TQ is still going to equal the select. So if this is the path that we're outputting, now we're going to download it as a CSV file, and that's going to return all of the data within an array type format. So let's copy that full URL and just paste that into our JavaScript code. I'm going to update the view properties so that we can wrap and see the full statement within the code. So when we paste it within the browser, we see that we're downloading the file contents from the spreadsheet. And what is going to happen is that the content is going to get returned back. So the response content, when you make a request to that endpoint, it's going to return it back as data. And we can also be specific. So let's add a few other values so that we can dynamically generate this. We can have one that's going to be called query. And within query, this is where we can have the select value. And that's just selecting everything. And you can also update the queries as well. And these are going to work just like SQL queries. We can also specify a specific sheet. So where we've got the output of CSV, we can select any one of the sheets. And this one is just called sheet 1. And we need to include the %20 for the space for the URI. So that's going to return back the sheet 1 contents. So let's make a function where we're going to run and get the data, and then construct the URL, the endpoint, using the base. And I'll use the backticks. So we're going to start out with the base URL, and then join it with the ID value. And then we've got the TQ. And I'll just add this in manually here. And we'll select the sheet as well. And then we can make it update dynamically afterwards. And what we'll do for now is we're going to output the endpoint into the console. And let's invoke the function getData. And we'll see what that looks like. And that should just be ID. So that's so far what we've got. So we've got the /d and then the value there. So let's add the next value, and that's going to be from the TQ. We'll make a fetch request to the endpoint to see what we're getting returned back. So making the fetch request to the endpoint. And then once we do get the response back, we're going to return the response back as text. And then the next part of the promise is going to retrieve the content as data. And then we can make use of the content and output the data object into the console. So this is going to be the response back from the endpoint. And that should be actually response res, and save that. So this is what we're getting so far as a response. And this is not formatted as JSON. And this is exactly what we're getting back within the text file. So we need to clean this up in order to make use of it, as there's a lot of excess content in each one of these, and we don't have an exact clear separation of the content in rows. Let's update that as JSON. And actually we need to name it JSON Data so that we're not naming it the same as the JSON object in JavaScript. So we're actually not retrieving it back as proper JSON structured content. So let's output, and we'll check what we've got within the output of data once again. So the structure isn't proper JSON data. So let's make some updates to what we're retrieving back so that we can actually get back some JSON formatted text. So instead of outputting the CSV, so I'm going to update the TQ value and use the JSON formatted TQ value. And we are returning back JSON object, but again, it isn't going to be properly structured as a JSON object. So we do need to do some cleanup of some of the content that's been returned back. And we need to extract the content from the table. So let's clean up the data before we try to parse it. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to remove off part of the content from the beginning. And that's going to include this character set, as well as the Google visualization query response. And simply just replace that to clear that out. And that way we're going to get proper JSON structured content. There's a couple ways to do that, where we could simply cut part of the returned data using a slice, or we can just do a replace of that content. So let's do, first we'll try to do a replace and just create a variable called temp. So this is what we're going to be using for the data. And we've got our data text that's come back. And of course this is in a text format, so it's not going to be in a JSON format. And I'll try to do the JSON parse on the temp value. So we want to use replace so that we can remove out the query for, first off, want to remove out this content and simply just do a replace with just some empty space. So now our temp slightly cleaned up, and we also need to update that. So apply, and now this time we're doing a replace on the temp. So we want to remove out the rest of the excess content so that it can be actually output as JSON. So we want to remove out this content from Google visualization and do a clean of that output. And we're still throwing an error there, and this time it's just at the end there. So this is messing up the value there right at the end. So I want to remove out that closing bracket. So just as we did before with the temp, let's do a replace so that we can clean that closing part of it as well. So we're looking for anything that's got this structure to closing. Let's output into the console the result of temp. so that we can see the final result that we've got. And it looks like we're getting undefined there. So I just need to make sure that we're replacing it with a blank. So that looks like it worked. We were able to clean up the code. And now when we do the JSON parse, we've actually got an object that we can parse through. And then under the table, this is where we've got all of the columns of data and then all of the rows that are going to include the content. So we have something that we can work with as we've got some cleaned up data. And let's create a function now to output data, and then whatever the data is that we're passing in there. And then within the console, we'll take a look at what we've got for data. So let's run this function. And now that we've got it within a JSON format, we can select the table and we'll output to the output data, the JSON data, and pass in the table object to there. So that gives us columns and rows that now we can go through, we can iterate through in order to construct our object. And each one of the rows, so now we've got data and rows, and we can use for each to iterate through each one of the rows. So output it as row, and we can console log each one of the rows. So outputting all of that into the console, and it's actually returned back some of the empty content. So that means that we need to, and each one of these rows, this is its own array. So we want to loop through the content and just to see if there is content there within the structure. I'm going to set up a blank array. It will populate that array with the contents that's contained within each one of these rows. And we'll check to see if the value, so take the row and then for each item in the row, and this is going to be returning back the cell. So if there is content within the cell object, and we have to, once again, we'll log out that cell object. So what we've got for cell is going to return back this object, and the value within the cell is going to be under V. So let's see what that gets output. And here we're returning back null. So we have to check to see if the value of the cell is null. So just check the value of the cell. And it's actually not going to be row. It's going to be row with the object of C. So we need to include that as we iterate through. And now we can see we're actually returning back the values. So let's check to see if the value is null, and if it's not null, then we can add it into the array. So set up holding array. I'll just call it holder. And then these ones are the ones where we're going to set the row data in. So if cell is not equal to null, then we're going to add that cell holder, and we'll push the value of the cell, which is going to be under V, into the holder. And then as we loop through, so we're going to stop outputting all of these into the console. And as we iterate through, we take holder and push. Actually, we're going to push holder into the array that we're constructing. And then lastly, we'll output and console log the array contents. So now we've got an array with actual values that are not null. We also need to add the headings. So notice that the headings are not there within the rows, as the rows automatically are starting with the data. So it's automatically skipping that first column of content. So this is where we need to loop through the columns and then use those column values in order to make the headings. So let's make a selection. So we've got our main array, and then before we set up the rows, let's take the data, and we've got the data columns, from the table. And just as we did with the rows, we can loop through each one. And then we've got the column array object. And then for the column array objects, we can console log those out while we're developing it. And we're going to get all of those added into the column. So we've got the initial column with the label, first, last, ID, and status. And then if there's no label, then that means that that's going to end the rows of data. So as we go through, let's check to see if there's a label. And we can output the label into the console. So when we have the first, last, ID, and status, so it's going to correspond to the labels of the content. So let's add those. And we'll create another array. So just call that array 2. And this is where we can populate the headings. So array 2, push the column label. And we're going to apply a condition to this, that if column label, then we're going to add it into the array. And then after we finish iterating through the content, we can take the array and we can push the array2 result, which will add the headers into the main array that we've just been constructing. So we've got first, last, ID, and status. And if we want to fine-tune what we've got for rows, instead of searching for null, we only want to get the first columns because that's the only ones that we have labels. So we know that whatever array 2 is the length of it, that means that we can loop through those and then just use those values. So instead of having I'm going to block this comment out. And instead of pushing it the cell value, we can simply just loop through using a value of x equals 0 and loop through while x is less than array2 length, because that's going to give us the number of columns. And we just want to return back the first values that are within the row. So once again, we'll console log the value of row C. And for row C, we only want to get the first 4 items there. We don't want the entire row C value. So we'll index value that with the value of x. So now we're returning back the values. And we only want the value, just as we did with the cell value. So that's returning back the actual values that are contained within the columns. So we can actually push that information into the holder array. So instead of console logging it out, we'll push it into the holder array. So that reconstructs our new array with only the data that we've got present within the spreadsheet, only using those first 4 column values. And even if any of these are blank, it's not actually going to skip it within the array. And this is actually much better to do it this way, because this is actually going to output the value properly. We notice that if it is blank, it's going to throw an error. So that's because I emptied out and it's null. So it doesn't have a value for C. So let's do a quick check to make sure that there's no blank value. So we'll console log out whatever we've got for the value here. And I'll actually just do it that way. So we've got a value of null. So we can apply a condition. And actually we'll do a ternary operator for the value. And we'll check to see if it doesn't exist. And if it doesn't exist, then we're just going to leave it blank. But if it does exist, then we're going to return back the value of the v. And that way, if we console log out the result and insert val instead. And let's double check to see if we have a value before applying a condition to it. So it looks like we're still throwing the error. And check to see what we've got for row C. So it's coming back as null. So we'll check to see if it's equal to null. And that fixed that issue there if it's coming back as null. So we don't need to actually console log these out. And now we should have the proper structure for the rows. Let's double check and make sure that the number 9 and that this one did apply the space properly, so it applied the blank value. So we're ready to take this content and output it to the page. So we've got the output data. So let's select the page element so that we can output it to the page. So using document query selector, select the element with a class of output. And this is where we can output the content. So now that we've got it properly structured, I can comment out some of the console messages. So it's a lot more clear what content we're outputting. And it looks like we've got a few other console logs. So that just outputs the finished and the ready array. So that means that now we can loop through the array. And we're going to just create a separate function. And whenever array is ready, then we're going to add to page the array object and create a function. It's going to be called add to page. And this can just take in data. And we're going to iterate through the data and then add the page elements. So data is going to be an array, so we can loop through each one of those. And select that. And let's output it to the page. So let's create the main div. So this can serve as the parent div using the document create element and create the parent div. Then we want to loop through each one of the values within vals, as we've got an array there. So take vals and then for each. And we'll just return this back as val. And these are the different cell containers. Create element. And these as well can be, actually these will be spans. And just let me update this to span. So we're going to create a bunch of spans. And the span will have text, content, and that's going to be equal to whatever the value of val is. And take main, append the span to the main. And then as we loop through, we'll take output and append main to the output area. So that gives us all of the results being output. And it looks like we're still throwing an issue there that we're not clearing out. And it looks like it's running multiple times. And that's because I need to take the add to page and bring it out of that. So now we've got the content properly structured on the page, and we can apply some styling to it. So let's apply some styling. Style and border, and we'll make a light border for it. Also for the span, style, width, and we've got 4 of them. So if we do it 25%, span, style, and display. We'll do the display as inline block. So that will space them out better. Within the page as itself, we need to apply the box sizing. So apply that property to all the elements and apply the border box sizing to it. so that way it will space it out properly. Let's also update the span style and set the height of the element. And setting the height. And that blank one is actually throwing things off. So let's update that. And we'll do a condition. So do let spacer. And if val is equal to just blank, so another ternary operator, we're going to add a space in there. And that actually should be the question mark. And if it's not equal to blank, then we're just going to have whatever the value of val is. So this is going to give us the ability to apply essentially a space if it's blank. And that's what's throwing off the column data. And actually, let's put a dash instead, and then we'll get rid of the height there. So that gives us the content that's being displayed. And we can also apply conditions. So if the status is true, then we can apply to the whole main element. So let's do a condition and check to see if val, actually I'm just going to apply that over here, where we'll check to see if the value of vals with the index value of 3 is equal to true. And if it is, then we'll take main style and update the background color and set the background color to be green. So all the ones that now are true are going to be coming back as green. And then else we can set the background color to be red. Also for main style, let's set the color, so the font color to be white. And we'll also take the main style and do the text align and center align the text. So that gives us. And then also let's check to see if the index value. So if the index value, if index, so we'll have our condition, if index is equal to 0, then we're going to apply a special style property to the span. So we need to do this after we declare the span. And we'll set the span style and background color. So set that to be black. And also span style. And let's set the font size. So it's be 1.2 EM. So that will make the first. And actually we need to do this on the row, not the column. So as we're iterating through vals, we'll check the index value there. So this needs to be applied to, if the index value is that, then we'll update the values for main. And we'll overwrite these values where we've got the color for the Boolean values. It looks like we're throwing an error. So that gives us more of a proper structure for the headings. And of course, you can apply styling as needed. Also, let me clear out the inner text or inner HTML of output, so we can remove out that hello world. So now all of the content here is going to be exactly what's coming from the spreadsheet. So go ahead, create your own spreadsheet, and then use JavaScript to pull it out and display the contents of the spreadsheet on within your HTML code.